I always find it enjoyable, relaxing to shovel the driveways, so something very peaceful about that. I don't get that feeling much here in Tulsa. Well, if you live next to me and I could walk there, I would. If I got to drive there, not so much. Okay, so today we're going to go ahead and start talking about numbers. But did anybody have any questions from last week on dating or anything else that we've covered that you want some clarification on? Yes, sir? Yes, sir? Uh-huh. So are you talking about either the start of Revelation or the passage of Matthew 24? Well, we'll talk about that when we get Revelation next quarter here. But one of the verses we'll look at today will be 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter talks about that you'll suffer for a little while, and a little while there is their whole life. And when he mentions that, he's talking about the suffering that's going to take place with the church from when Peter wrote his epistle all the way to when he comes back. So that's a little while, but that's so far, close to 2,000 years. So it is instructive for us to come to appreciate when we look at children and the way they see time, and we look at ourselves. And then we look at previous generations, and it's invariably true that older generations emphasized how fast time went. The year just sort of flew by, and they can't believe it's over. And that's because they see time differently than young people, where it just drags out. So, truly, from God's point of view, it's like that, and the world's over. From our point of view, it's like we're 5 years old, waiting for the school year to end so we can get to summer break. And it just takes forever and ever and a few more evers. Okay? But we will talk more about that next quarter. Any other questions? Okay. Let's go ahead and get into talking about numbers. So everybody agrees that numbers mean something in the Revelation. It's a question of what they mean that everybody disagrees about. Some would say that all the numbers should be understood in a literal sense, unless there's some compelling reason to understand it otherwise. So I was reading one commentary, and he had a lengthy discourse showing why we should understand these numbers in the Revelation in a very literal sense, because there's nothing in their point of view compelling to say something otherwise here. Other people would say they're symbolic, figurative, liturgical, typological, something other than literal. And then there's people that say they're a combination of both. So that'd be one of the ways in which I would teach, is that numbers are both literal and symbolic. So, for example, in chapter 1, we have John writing to the 7 churches of Asia. Well, he is writing to 7 literal churches here. So that is true. Those are 7 churches. They're not 6, there's not 8, there are 7 churches there. But it's symbolic in as much as he's writing to more than just those 7 churches. He's writing to all of us, which is why each of the letters ends by saying, he who has an ear, let him hear what Jesus says or the Spirit says to the churches. So you're reading this, what I wrote to church at Ephesus, well, it applies to you. Apply it to yourself. Learn, avoid these things, do these good things here. So there's a sense in which it's both of those. By my count, there are almost 300 occurrences of numbers in the Revelation. So I don't know the last time any of you read Revelation, but almost every other verse or so has a number in it, which is more than, as far as I know, than any other book. We have tons of numbers in the Revelation. So it is important it is important for us to get a handle on how we understand numbers, because it's just a common feature of the Revelation. Lots of them are found all over the place here. So I said that. We have fractions in there. We have cardinal numbers. We have ordinal numbers. We have large numbers. We have small numbers. We got all kinds of numbers. So here's a list of what we got in the Revelation. 1/10, a tenth of the city, a fourth of the earth, a third of the earth, a half hour, 1 hour, 2 witnesses, 3 quarts, 3.5 days. And these are not all the occurrences of any one of these numbers. This is just an example of each of those occurrences here. We got first angel, second seal, third woe. So we got the cardinal number and the ordinal number as well. We have 4 living creatures, 4th seal, 5 months, 5th angel, 6 wings, 6th seal, 7 churches, 7th angel. It's an 8th, talking about the mark of the beast, name of the beast, name of man. Talking about the kings. 9th topaz, 10 days, 12 stars, 24 thrones, 42 months, 144 cubits, 666, 1,000 years, 1,260 days, 7,000 people, 12,000 of each tribe sealed, 144,000 servants, 200 million troops. So there's just a lot of numbers mentioned in this book, from very small to very large. Typically, when you have a class on the Revelation, when they talk about numbers, they'll give you something like this. And they usually just spend a few minutes talking about it here. 2 is the number of valid witnesses. 3 often relates to God. 4 often symbolizes the world or God's creation. 5 is the number of fingers on a human hand, describing a handful or a few. 10, 2 handfuls, represents several. Neither 10 nor 5 should necessarily be interpreted literally in apocalyptic writings. 7 is the number of fullness, completeness, perfection. 6 is 1 less than 7. Doesn't measure up to 7 or attain to the fullness of 7. 6 then symbolizes incompleteness, imperfection, sometimes evil. 8, Christian apocalypse, symbolizes Jesus Christ. 12 tends to represent the people of God. Multiples of these numbers typically represent the fullness or complete number of the things symbolized. For example, the 144,000, 12 times 12 times 1,000. Revelation 7 represents the full number of the people of God. So I just pulled it from one commentary here, but I could have pulled it from almost every commentary. They just give you a little section on numbers saying, this number means this, and let's move on. And we have a tendency to approach numbers in the Revelation much like a mathematical formula or a secret code, that this number means this. So now that when I see this number used in Revelation chapter 7, I just plug my little meaning in here, and now I understand what John must have meant here. But rarely, when teachers teach, is any justification provided or any nuance used. Instead, we pass on what we have always heard, and sometimes that may not be correct. For instance, oftentimes you'll hear the number 10 used, and they'll talk about it being positive because we have 10 fingers. That's the way God made us. 10 toes, 10 commandments. You know, a good thing. But we don't think about the 10 plagues. You know, that's not necessarily a good thing. That's a judgment. And so we don't oftentimes give you much justification as to why numbers mean whatever it is we're saying we're meaning. And I know when I first was taught the Revelation, I was given something similar to this. because that's the way my teacher had been taught. That's the way he had been taught. You know, it just keeps going back, and we can go back more than 1,000 years and find people saying, well, this number means this number means this, and no real justification given. It's just what we've always heard. To help us think about how John uses numbers, we'll examine a relatively innocuous example, because I want us to think about numbers here. So let's turn over to Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And then if one of you fine brothers and sisters like to read that, you'd be blessed. Smyrna?
Right. The first and the last who was dead and has come to life says this: I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.
All right.
He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death.
All right, thank you. So, what does John mean when he says you'll have tribulation for 10 days? This is a part of our show. It's called audience participation. So, I'm not going to point out any right answers or wrong answers. I just want some answers. Okay, so 240 hours. A short time. Anything else? Okay. One possibility is, like Joseph mentioned, is that John means it literally. That is to say that some of the church in Smyrna will be cast into prison for 240 hours. What do you think about that? What are strengths and weaknesses of understanding it in a literal sense?
Well, you know, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Like you can, if you know how many days or hours, you can hold out hope for an end.
Okay, I can see that. So if we understand it literally, then it definitely brings it more under control, that we can say, okay, I can endure this short period of time. All right. Any other positives? Negatives? It is possible. Okay. All righty. Today, if somebody was to use this phrase, then we would understand it in this way, literal. As a matter of fact, we even note our community service down to the hour. So, what you want to realize is that in our culture, we see numbers vastly different than in previous cultures here. Numbers have a very precise meaning for us today. This is why we use a decimal point. This is why when you have math class, you either learn to incorporate the decimal point and however many significant figures the teacher requires of you, or you get it wrong. This is why some people really love math, some people really hate math, because numbers just make sense to some people and not to other people here. So almost all of you guys have a watch or a watch on your phone, and we're tracking time down to the minute all the time. We have meetings that are set to start at this exact moment, and time is very important to us because numbers are very important to us here. But would that be how the church at Smyrna understood it? Possibly. One of the festivals they celebrated that we know about from inscriptional evidence in the area of Smyrna was a celebration of Naomi's slain children. And it was a 10-day festival that was held there every year or so. We know, again, from and scriptural evidence that there were gladiatorial games held in Smyrna that lasted 5 days. Of course, that's not 10 days, but John says you'll be cast into prison, so we're assuming, or the author's assuming, that they'll be held in prison for 5 odd days and then cast into the gladiatorial games to be sacrificed to the animals, to these soldiers, to whomever here. So it is possible that the church at Smyrna understood it in a literal sense. So we do have some possibilities for that. On the other hand, another possibility to understand the phrase in a figurative sense. So if we understood it in a figurative sense, what would its meaning be? So Mary Sue said a short time, okay? Any other possibilities that come to mind? 10 years? Okay, we'll mention this, but in Ezekiel, we have the biblical principle that a day is equal to a year. So the prophet was commanded to sleep on one side 40 odd days, sleep on the other side 360 days, because one day he was on this side was representative of 1 year of captivity for the nation. So that's a possibility. And if that were true, Diocletian, so that was the last emperor who engaged in a systematic persecution of the church. He actually engaged in about a 10-year period. It just really depends on how you date everything. But again, you do want to realize and remind yourself that we expect a level of precision in regards to time and numbers that the ancient world would have thought was stupid. This is also why you always have a question about Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days. Because he was executed on Friday night, and he rose Sunday morning. And people go like, well, that's not 3 days. But he keeps saying 3 days, so the teacher usually has to explain that 3 days means the parts of 3 days, not 72 hours. But when we say 3 days, we usually mean 72 hours. I'll get back to you in 3 days. I'll show up in 3 days. And I know that in my life, when people have given me a time frame and they show up earlier, well, that's frustrating. My dad was famous for that. I'll show up at your house 2 o'clock. We're busy cleaning the house, getting things ready. He'd show up 3 hours early. It's like, dude, I'm trying to work here. You're throwing everything off. Now you want me to take care of you. And so we expect people to adhere to whatever time frame they say because, again, time is of concern to us. One author understood it in a liturgical sense because some see a connection between the 7 feasts in Leviticus and the Revelation. So Leviticus 23 notes there's a 10 days between the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. We won't get into this much when we study the Revelation, but there are a number of people who draw a strong correlation between the way the Revelation is organized and the feasts as they're described in Leviticus. And so they'll take those 7 feasts, divide the Revelation up into 7 sections, correlate all these things here. This author is a proponent of that. But that's how they understand the 10 days. 10 days between the Feast of Trumpets to the Day of Atonement. In the Old Testament, 10 days was used as a round number. So, it could mean a limited time here. A few authors see it referring to 10 different periods of persecution that started with Nero and ended with Diocletian. So, when we look at church history, we can take 10 separate emperors who engaged in some form of persecution against the church. And so that's how they understand the 10 days. As was mentioned, Wendell mentioned, the persecution under Diocletian was approximately 10 years long, so the day-year principle in Ezekiel 4. On the other hand, 10 oftentimes representative of a large number. So it wasn't meant to be a small number, it was meant to be a large number. Some authors make connection to the 10 Commandments, others between 10 fingers and toes, and still others to the 10 plagues of Egypt. Still another consideration is days. Does it indicate a short time or not? Psalm 90 and verse 4, 1,000 years is like a day for God. A little while, the life of the Christian, an entire time period from then until Jesus' return. So even the word days isn't indicative consistently of a short period of time. I find myself second-guessing myself when people say how long you're going to be, and I say a few seconds or a few minutes. And I wonder myself, well, why did I say a few seconds? Because I'm going to be longer than a few seconds. But obviously, in my mind, it's going to be less time than when I usually say a few minutes. And so there must be some internal consistency or inconsistency in why I do that. And all of us have our time references that we give to people that involve numbers, and we don't understand it necessarily in a literal sense. We understand it in a figurative sense, not actually meaning that here. There are exceptions. My wife was continually frustrated with me in our early years of marriage because she'd say, "Can you give me a couple tissues?" And in my mind, a couple meant exactly two. Not three, not one. It always meant two. In her mind, couple meant a handful. More than two. 3, 4, 5, or whatnot here. And so it took her a long time to realize if she said a couple, I would only give her two. And she would end up saying, "Give me several of these sort of things here." Well, that's just an internal inconsistency that I toe the line on. That one be exactly literal, but figurative and all kinds of other things here. And so we're just sort of a mass of contradictions here. So let's summarize what we got so far here. It could be literal or it could be figurative. It could be a long period of time or a short period of time. So how should we proceed? How do we determine what 10 days means? Thoughts? Sentence structure, okay. We can definitely employ grammatical analysis, and we will for certain things here. I didn't bring that up as an example because it gets really complicated, so I didn't want to do that one. Yes, sir? Well, I didn't do it in Greek, and that makes it more complex. Yes, sir?
I don't know anything about Roman law, but is there any significance to the punishment in that? Assuming that it was literal, there was some kind of significance to a punishment in the Roman world.
Yeah, we view law vastly different than the Romans did. So they would engage in fines, and punishments usually ended in death. They didn't have a middle ground. So if we were to go back in time and talk about our term incarceration, or talk about remedial punishment, or talk about offender relapse, things like that, they just wouldn't be able to comprehend what we're saying. Because in their mind, you either paid what you owed or you were killed. And that was it. And so they didn't have punishments that lasted a certain time. They just killed you, got rid of you. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
There's many references to those in prison.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a death penalty for certain people. And so I guess I'm trying to understand. If I was to proceed, one of the things I would first look at is there anything that would tell me this is literal, like law
Mm-hmm.
or anything? And if it isn't, then that would put me in a different direction. So when you ask how to proceed, my first would be, okay, let me understand Roman law and what that means, especially for Christians, punishment for Christians. Is that
Well, as we progress here, we'll address both of those and give you some examples that'll show things here. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am?
Well, it's kind of like we use the term a lifetime.
Uh-huh.
A lifetime of something. That's, some people live for 2 hours, some people live for 110 years. So a lifetime is relative. I think when we focus on the time, we're missing the message. The message was they would understand the message. But what we need to understand is they were told ahead of time that this would happen. And they were told it could get bad, it could even be put to death, but to be faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. So it's not important for us to understand how long their persecution was. They knew what that meant. What God is saying is, no matter what persecution is, be faithful. I will give you the crown of life, even if you die for me.
Okay, very good. So here's the three questions I have for us. The first question we need to ask and answer would be, on the literal figurative spectrum, where do numbers as a general happenstance fall? So like Earl was talking about, should we understand 10 days more literal, for example, like they use in law, or should we understand it in a slightly figurative sense here? Second question would be how the original readers would have understood the phrase. And then to go to Mary Sue, final question concerns John's purpose in writing it. So what is his ultimate purpose in saying these things to the church there? So let's talk about literal or figurative. In our class so far, we've explored a number of different aspects of apocalyptic writing. So we've had 6 weeks, almost 6 hours of talking about things that would indicate that we should should be to a figurative meaning rather than to try to fit everything into a literal one. And that's what I've tried to get you to see, is that for the most part, John writes in symbolic language, and while it has a literal component to it, like we were saying earlier about the 7 churches, it has more of a figurative component to it because those 7 churches represent all churches from that time on to whenever the world ends. One passage that provides some clarity on this issue for us would be Revelation 17 and verse 12. Who would like to read that?
The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received the kingdom, but they received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour.
Okay, so I know we're jumping way to the end of the Revelation there, but we got kings, we got kingdoms, but what I want you to see is that he mentions they're going to reign, these kings are going to reign for 1 hour. It's interesting to note that the author who interpreted the 10 days in a literal sense, when he got to this passage, he interpreted it in a figurative sense. And he said the 1 hour, talking about how long these empires would last, was less than the 42 months, but obviously more than 1 hour. Because it doesn't make sense from any point of view to say these 10 kings are going to reign for 1 hour. It doesn't make sense in any sort of way, which is why the author, who thinks we should understand everything in a very literal sense, says we need to go to a figurative sense for this. His only concession is to say it's less than the 42 months. Well, I mean, 1 hour, less than 42 months, seems like a no-brainer on that, but maybe we need to understand it slightly different here. A different author says this: since the 1 hour of the reign of the 10 kings with the beast cannot conceivably be intended literally, we should not expect any of the time periods in the Revelation to be literal. What do you think about that?
I think it's hard to make one decision based for the whole book. You have to look at each context separately
Well, so with the revelation, that's why I wanted you to understand that it's apocalyptic writing, it's prophetic writing here, and most everything in there is figurative. So even the things that are literal still have a figurative, symbolic component to it, showing this is how we should understand it here. So nobody denies that John really was on the Isle of Patmos and that he wrote to these 7 churches here. The only question is, did he mean that for anything more than those 7 churches? So there are people in the Christian umbrella who would understand the revelation to have no applicability to us today because it was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was destroyed, more than 1900 years ago. And so all we get is just some feel-good messages that we might be able to extrapolate from a few verses in Revelation. But the rest of it was for that church, and it has nothing to do with us today. Yes, sir?
Using 17:12,
Mhm.
I would assume you would say that the 10 kings were little. Is that not true?
No.
No, you would say that's figurative. So there's 10 kings, which is figurative. And then the 10, the 10 horns would be figurative.
Uh-huh.
And 10 kings is figurative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And then why would you think 1 hour would be figurative?
I don't.
Oh, well, no, I mean, should there, I mean, say that. Is there anyone that fits that list?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so, I'm sorry. There wasn't anybody I could find that interpreted the 1 hour literal. But they do interpret the 10 kings and the 10 horns in a literal sense. So this is why I quoted the author. So I could only find 2 authors. I mean, I could find more, but I only referenced 2 authors that understood 10 days in chapter 2 as being 10 literal days, which is why I wanted to see what they interpreted for the 1 hour. And they interpret the 1 hour in a very figurative sense, even though, like you're saying, they understand the 10 horns and the 10 kings in a very literal sense. But the 1 hour, there's no way to understand that literally, so they go to a figurative sort of sense here. So they would understand that we should understand everything in a literal sense unless there's some reason it doesn't make sense, and then we'll go to a figurative. Whereas what I'm trying to teach you is to flip that around, is that we should understand everything in a figurative sense unless there's some compelling reason to say it's got to be understood in a literal sense. And then I'm also saying that even when we understand in a literal sense, there's oftentimes a symbolic, figurative, typological, antitypological component to it so we can understand it as more than just this literally, like the 7 churches here. Okay, so I know that was complicated. It just gets more complicated. So how do Christians in Smyrna understand this phrase here? Today, our culture understands numbers in a significantly different way than people in the first century. And we've already mentioned some of this stuff. While we sometimes use numbers in a figurative sense, 24/7, oftentimes we default to a very literal sense. Again, I've passed this story on. I had a friend, a computer programmer engineer, and he had a child with special needs. And his wife had gone away, and she called him up because he had said the child had a fever. She's like, well, what's his fever? He said 103. Well, she flipped out, rushed back home, and when he saw her at the door, he's like, why are you home? She's like, you said he had 103 fever. He said, no, I said 103. And is a decimal point, 100.3. All of you have written checks because you're the last generation that's going to write checks, and you write checks, and the and is a decimal point. And so he used that number in a very precise sense because numbers mean something to him, but all she heard was he had 103 fever. Why are you not rushing him to the ER? Those sort of things here. So for the most part, we use things in a very literal sense for numbers. But we need to realize that people in the first century did not. The Greeks didn't have a separate character for most numbers, nor do they have an understanding of zero. So we use Arabic numbers. They don't have anything. They would just use their letters. They have 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, and they added 3 letters that had fallen out of use from previous centuries, and then that's what they used for numbers, were letters. Sometimes those letters were combined into a number that made a real word, and sometimes they didn't make any sort of word. You just knew that they were numbers based on the context here, which meant they saw numbers in a vastly different way. We use a decimal system, so we see a connection between 40 plus 4 is 44. And we can see that when we write it down. But the Greeks just use letters. So they would use the letter mu for 40 and delta for 4, and they'd combine those 2 letters, and that'd be 44. And it didn't matter to them the order of those letters. Okay? You could have mu first and then delta, or delta first and then mu. Either way, this was 44. And because of those things, they just looked at numbers in a lot different fashion than we do. On the other hand, since letters could be numbers, they saw connections that we wouldn't see. For instance, the mark of the beast. And we may be able to have a chance to talk about this next week here, but it confuses us how 666 can convert to a name, because 666 is a number, and all we do with numbers are manipulate them to discover truths about the universe, sort of thing, not to hide a code in them. What this means is that it's a little challenging for us to see what the early Smyrnans would have saw when they saw the phrase 10 days. So let's look at the last thing. What did John want to accomplish with this phrase? He wants Christians to know that Satan will cast some of them into prison and they'll be tested. We need to understand what John meant by prison. So let me give you this quote here and we'll talk about it. Prisoners in city jails lived in squalor and cramped spaces. Stone walls, often without windows, created a dark, suffocating enclosure. During the day, prisoners wore collars and manacles on one hand, while at night they slept on the ground with their legs in stocks so they could not stretch them out. Rations were scant, could be withheld by the jailer. In antiquity, people were not sentenced to prison terms as they are in our modern times. People were put in prison in order to force them to obey the authorities, or to hold them in custody until their cases came for trial, or to confine them until they were executed or punished in some other way. So prisons were just a holding place until a judgment could be made against you. They either held you there until you coughed up the money you owed somebody, or you died in there. This is why Jesus talks about going to visit people in prison. Because in prison, they might have given you some food, they might not have, they didn't care. Our society defaults to you're innocent until proven guilty. Their society would have defaulted to you're in prison, you're worthy of death. And lots of Christians would have been in prison throughout the history of the early church for reasons that, from our point of view, had been trumped up charges. And they would die if people in the church did not go to them on a daily basis and give them food, give them water, give them clothing, do what they could for them. So when Paul was made a prisoner, he appealed to Caesar, so they had to take care of him until he could get be in front of Caesar. And so they didn't take care of him in a good form or fashion, which is why in his letters he talks about that people sent him resources to take care of him because he didn't have the resources himself. And for his situation, he was always chained to a Praetorian guard. So, he was always in manacles of some form or fashion. When we read in the Acts, when the Philippian jailer, woke up and the earthquake had happened and he thought all the prisoners were gone, it was going to be his life because as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, somebody had to pay the price. And if it wasn't these people who were guilty, it'd be the one who was in charge of the guilty. Somebody was going to die because somebody had to die. That's the only way to balance out the scales, And we want to see prisons in a completely different light in the first century. So when John says Satan is going to cast you into prison, it's just not we're going to put you into jail before your case comes before the magistrate and then you'll have a chance to make your case. No, you were cast into prison so you could die. That was it. If you went to prison and you didn't owe money, you were going to be executed in some form or fashion unless somebody had some influence with the powers that be and they could get you out. Since Jesus' prediction of the coming affliction closes with the exhortation, be faithful unto death, the release that he promises after the 10 days may not be a return to freedom on Smyrna's streets, but something better, martyrdom. The apparent defeat, that is, paradoxically, the supreme victory. So, again, let's open back up to Revelation chapter 2. So in verse 8, Revelation chapter 2, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but I know you're rich, and they're blasphemed by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So there was something going on in this city where Jewish people were accusing the Christians of something that was offensive to the Roman Empire. Now, the temple had been destroyed, which is why Judaism was null and void. When God destroyed the temple records were wiped out, so there was no longer a relationship like there had been with Moses. That was done away. The only way to have a relationship with God was through Jesus. And if you continue to ignore Jesus and try to yoke yourself under the old law, well, he says you're a synagogue of Satan here. He says in verse 10, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison. So not all of you are going to go into prison. Some of you are going to go into prison. And that was one of the more terrifying aspects of the persecutions that happened in the early centuries, was that they were inconsistent, intermediate, hit or miss. Literally, the soldier would knock on one door and ignore the next two neighbors and then go down to this door over here. Because, again, they were doing their job, but people don't want to do their job. So this is why oftentimes police officers won't do something to you at the end of their shift because it just makes more paperwork for them. They're not going to get paid for it. They're going to let you go with just a warning here. So that you'll be tested and you'll have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So you're going to have tribulation for 10 days. You're going to be cast into prison. Be faithful unto death. So the opportunity was going to arise while they're in prison to be unfaithful to God. If they were faithful, they would die. If they were unfaithful, maybe something different would happen. Yes, sir?
That word tribulation
Uh-huh.
is used in verse 9, and it says, I know your tribulation. And then verse 10,
Mhm.
Is it referring to the same thing? In other words, we're getting into that, God knows there's going to be persecution, and then there's a lot of secrecy. How do you get hold of that?
I would understand it, shooting from the hip. I would understand the tribulation there to be talking about tribulation that's caused by the Jewish people, the synagogue of Satan here. So they're already being persecuted on a number of different levels here. And then it's going to eventually reach the point to where the Roman Empire is going to intercede and start throwing people into jail. But we should not underestimate the influence that the Jewish community possessed in various locales. And given that Christians were seen as an aberration of the Jewish community, well, then if a Jew said, don't do business with this person, well, then other people would not do business with them. They would do business with the Jews because they had built up a relationship over however long. So that's how I'd understand that first use of tribulation. Talking about what they're suffering from the Jews. You want to say something different? Yes, no?
Well, I hate to keep
Oh, okay. Okay. So Pliny, and we'll see what he is, said that after Christians were denounced to him, he asked them in person, we have this from a letter, if they are Christians. And if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with a warning of the punishment that awaits them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. Pliny the Younger, letters 1096. Pliny, he wrote in the early part of the 2nd century, so it had been shortly after the time of the Revelation. While he's not talking about Christians in Smyrna, he is talking about Christians in his area, which gives us an idea of what the Roman government was thinking about Christians. So when Pliny wrote his letter, he was writing to somebody else saying, what should I do about Christians? He's saying, this is what I do. I ask them 1, 2, 3 times. If they don't get rid of their stubbornness about being Christians, if they don't acknowledge the deity of the Roman Empire, well, then I order them to be executed, and that's it. And so, no big deal. So we should understand from all this that one thing that John wants to accomplish was to encourage the Christians to persevere through any persecution. While we've not yet talked about the influence of the Old Testament on this writing to any great extent, we have mentioned it, and it plays a part in our understanding here, talking about the 10 days. All the commentators agree that Daniel was a significant influence on John when he wrote the Revelation. If we look at the start of Daniel, we see a connection to the phrase in question. Who would like to read Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 16?
Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the mighty drink. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. So why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who were of your age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days, let them be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And let our appearance and the appearance of our youth to eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward sent
Okay, thanks. So I want us to see that Daniel and his three friends were tested for 10 days, which is the phrase we're talking about. What does 10 days mean here? What is significant about this phrase, testing for 10 days, is that the issue is not one of persecution, talking about Daniel, but of accommodation. This may well be the situation at Smyrna. It's not so much that Christians are being persecuted for their faith, rather they're being pressured to accommodate themselves to pagan practices. Imprisonment, which is not a typical form of Roman punishment as such, could then be used to coerce Christians to adopt such practices with the threat of death if they refuse. There's no way of knowing exactly what the Christians in Smyrna face, but it's probably safe to say that, given the allusion of Daniel 1, there's no reason to take the 10 days literally. The close association between testing and tribulation also occurs in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10. What I want us to see is that John, when he wrote the Revelation, he incorporates a huge amount of the Old Testament within his book. And we'll talk in later lessons about the allusions he makes to the Old Testament, and we'll see how voluminous they are. But one of the primary books that he draws imagery from is the book of Daniel. You know, when we were talking about chapter 17, the 10 kings, 7 kings, 10 horns, those sort of things, that imagery comes from the book of Daniel here. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that when he says you'll be tested for 10 days, he's thinking back to Daniel and his three friends and them being tested for 10 days. Now, they were being tested because the chief eunuch wanted them to eat the foods that the king had provided for them because he thought that was best for them. But those foods would have violated Old Testament law. Those foods would have been sacrificed and acknowledged as being given by their gods, which is why Daniel says, we're not going to have those. We're just going to have vegetables. And you go ahead and test us for 10 days, and we'll see whether our God can keep us healthy and strong, eating these foods that are acceptable to Old Testament law versus the rest of the world who's eating all these rich foods. And at the end of the 10 days, they were healthy, looked like they should, and so the eunuch, he got what he needed to get. For the church at Smyrna, we shouldn't necessarily envision a situation where they're at home having dinner, Roman soldiers burst in and say, "Are you Christians? Yes, go to prison so we can toss you to the lions." It wasn't like that. It was more along the lines of something in their day-to-day life required them to acknowledge Caesar in some form or fashion, and they say, "Well, I just can't do that." The closest we get to that today are people who say, "Well, I can't play this game because it's on Sunday," or "I can't do this activity because it's on Wednesday." And people are like, "Well, what are you doing? What do you mean you can't do this?" And so it's about that kind of pressure that was going on there, which is why Pliny, when he wrote his letter, said he gave the Christians opportunities, 3 in fact, to recant and say they would go ahead and cast a little incense to the altar to the Roman Empire and acknowledge their gods, acknowledge the deity of the emperor, do something showing that the Roman Empire is the world to be. And many Christians would refuse to do that, but lots of Christians gave in to temptation. As a matter of fact, at the end of Diocletian's reign, when the persecution was all done and he was done away with, and Constantine rolled up and he came into power a few years later, and he became a Christian because he went under a sign of God, and he gathered all the Christian leaders he could to try to organize his government. One of the divisions that existed was between those Christians who had compromised with the Roman Empire and did not die, versus those Christians who had been in hiding for all these years and didn't die. And they did not get along at all, because these guys compromised and these guys didn't. And these guys had lots of people that died and these guys didn't. And so there was all this conflict. And so the church at Smyrna, when he says you're going to have tribulation for 10 days, the 10 days are that opportunity for the church to say, I'm going to submit to God, serve God, be faithful to God, or I'm going to give up and acknowledge the Roman Empire and save my own life. So, one last point about 10 is see how else John uses the number in the rest of the book. So he uses it a few times, 12, 13, 17, number of times there. And what we see is 10 is always a negative number in the Revelation. Elsewhere in the book, it refers to the 10 horns of the head of Satan, or the beast that represents the Roman Empire. So, in the rest of the book, 10 is just a bad number. That's not to say it has to be a bad number here, but it is to say that we're not going out on a limb to say that the 10 days of persecution isn't necessarily a good time for the Christians here. Okay, so let's summarize. We should understand the phrase in a figurative sense. We should understand that 10 days is not talking about a long time or a short time. Instead, John wants you to make a connection with Daniel 1 and what was going on there about accommodation or not. We should understand that the time of persecution is limited by God, so that's why he does say it's 10 days, but we don't know how long that persecution is going to last. It could be 10 literal days, it could be 1 hour, it could be an entire lifetime. So it is true that many Christians did have the opportunity to stand up for their faith saying, are you a Christian? Yes, off to the lions. No, you're saved. However, the majority of Christians had to struggle with how much accommodation to do, whether they would be faithful to God in the small things or not, like Daniel. So when he says you're going to have these 10 days of persecution, he's not trying to get you to think about 10 as if that means something by itself, or days as if that means something by itself. He wants you to think about that phrase and how it's been used in the Old Testament, specifically Daniel chapter 1. Those guys were tested 10 days, most likely 10 literal days, and they came through with flying colors, and they were tested because they did not compromise with the Babylonian Empire. Are the Smyrna Christians going to compromise? If they do, they'll save their life in the here and now, but they'll suffer in the next life. If they don't, well, you're going to be faithful unto death, so you're going to die, but you'll get that crown of life, and you will not suffer the second death. We should understand that some of the Christians would end up dying because they are faithful, like Daniel. This reference to a period of time, the first in the book, is mysterious. The phrase is usually understood to indicate a brief period in order to encourage the readers or hearers. But while the text undeniably has a hortatory, so an encouragement dimension, the presence of the term days does not necessarily point to either brevity or to extension. After all, for God 1,000 years are like a day. More important is the significance of the number 10. John used the number only in chapters 12, 13, 17, and always referred to the number of the horns, and in one case of diadems, crowns, of a satanic beast. In the last of these cases, the 10 horns are interpreted as being 10 kings. The number thus appears to be connected with negative and persecuting forces, while the references to kings and diadems recalls the political dimensions and manifestations of evil. Thus, there appears to be an internal pattern beyond John's choice of the number, since the agents in question also have the power to imprison and thus seem to possess some form of political authority. Inasmuch as the number 10 is also used to designate a totality, it follows that the period in question, regardless of whether it's short or long, represents the whole of persecution. So, any questions on 10 days? No questions on 10 days? Norman?
Sometimes we have a number mentioned that involves both persecution and protection. And I think that this 10 days could be that while you're going through this testing, you're going to still be protected or still be in God's.
Is God will save your soul, though your life may be done away with. We're out of time here, so we'll have to start there next week. And then we'll try to spend some time talking about individual numbers. We'll definitely be reading a lot more Old Testament, so I'm going to need more of you to step up and be willing to read God's Word. Don't be ashamed. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. Class dismissed.